Hey everyone, so it's time we get back to our little Unimog 421 project. And this time we are going to start doing some engine work and get all the parts back on that so we can be done with this whole lower half of the vehicle. So let's go ahead and start that off with the gearbox. Alright, so first off I need a little plug or cover to go on here because this is still just closed off with some masking tape from when I painted it. But also I need the whole rubber seal or gasket that goes in between the transmission and the cab. And I need to put that on now because I can't actually do that once the cab is in place. Because once that is in position, that rubber gasket actually lifts up and hooks onto the bottom of it. So there's no way to put that on once you have the cab in place. So the one that was already mounted on this was this one. Now, it's looking a little rough, but it is usable, but it's actually not the correct one because it has this extra little hole right here. And I don't have that lever on mine because that is for the extra low range gears. But I was actually out a while ago buying some parts off another fellow Unimog enthusiast here in the country. And he also has a nice little 421. And he actually has this gear pattern in his, but conveniently for me, he had accidentally just bought this. And that's exactly what I needed for my transmission, so I just bought this one off him. And they're actually a little hard to come by because they don't make these anymore, so these are reproductions. But they also come without the metal framing, so I'm gonna have to build something to stiffen this up a little bit. I could just steal the frame that is on this, but I don't really want to. I'd like to keep this one more or less intact because this will actually work for the other little red 421 that I have. But I may just steal these little levers that hold it in place. It is already missing one of them, but I can build another one and then we can just come up with something else for mounting this in the red one if I do decide to use it. I'm thinking I'm just going to be building a frame out of some angled steel and probably a little plate to go around this corner to stiffen it up a little bit so it doesn't sag in the middle. The original ones also have that, so let's just go ahead and start with that. So there's nothing special going on in this hole, it's just an access point to this bolt in here. That is just holding the shift lever to this little shifter arm down in here. So I'm just going to make a nice little plastic cover to go over here just so it doesn't get filled with water and dirt. How am I gonna hold this? Haha. Okay. Nice. That actually looks really good. I'm happy with that. If you're wondering about this silver color, that was just some leftover paint from something else, because it's not really important. This was just to give it some weather protection, because this part is not really going to be visible anyway. Also, I don't know if it's strictly necessary to glue this down, but I just don't want it to be flapping around. See if we can do this without getting everything covered in glue. Well, I dreamed too big. Of course I was going to get covered in this stuff. Yeah, we can make something like that. Not too bad. That should do the trick. Well, here we go again. See if I can actually hold this in place while also turning these. Cool. That actually looks really nice. All right. So they were actually galvanized originally, but they're just gonna have to make do with some paint this time around. So I was actually just about ready to put this thing on, but then I realized I actually have a different problem. Because the holes in this, they are only big enough to fit the levers themselves. So I have to get these knobs off here. Now the old one had some really big holes in it, so I could just take that off in one piece. So I haven't had these things off yet. And they are rusted on here pretty good. There's like a little metal insert inside here. And because they are just round, there's not really any good way to get a good grip on these. So I'm gonna have to see if I can come up with something to hold these pretty good without actually destroying them. I could try and spray them down with some kind of penetrating oil, but they're all kind of upside down, so it's probably not really gonna work its way in there anyway. So I'm not gonna bother with that. You know what? I think I'll just put some force on it, but I don't want to put this directly on here, so I'm just going to put a little bit of cloth in between here. All right, let's give this a try. Pretty sure something is going to give, or it may just shatter. Oh yeah, it's it's shattering. Kind of figured this would happen. They are on there really good. They are probably all that bad. Oh wait, this one might actually come loose. Hooray! So, 2 survivors out of 4. Not great, not terrible. Well, actually, this one has been off all along, so that is kind of cheating. But at least these remaining inserts on here, they are hexagonal, so they should be a lot easier to get a grip on. Oh, that is on there really good. Yeah, that would not have come off in one piece no matter what I did. Oh man. Well, these have probably been on here since the 60s. Now, I think we can actually try and get this on here. It's probably going to be a bit fiddly. Kind of figured this parking brake would be a bit tricky to get through. It is the biggest one of them. Aha. All right, well that is actually it. I'm gonna do the last adjustments once the cab is back on and I have this hooked up in its proper placement, but for now this is actually looking pretty good. Nice. Right, so that turned out to be a slightly bigger project than I had in mind, but I actually think it worked out pretty well. So anyway, let's go ahead and throw a starter on here so we can run some new cables over to our battery box. And as for the starter itself, I'm not actually going to do anything to this because it works just fine. So I'm just going to clean it up a little and it'll just go right back on there. It does have a little mark on the side here from the compressor's air pipe that's been kind of rubbing up against it, but that's not anything that's going to hurt it. Let's just make these black parts black again real quick, because why not? Look at this thing. If I didn't show me shining it up, you would almost think I just got a new one. Now I know we could have just opened that up and had a quick look to see that the brushes weren't worn out and everything was looking all right, but if it isn't necessary, I'd rather not do that because they can be a bit tricky to get back together. So, besides, with the low miles on this truck, it's probably not worn out anyway. I'm just gonna have to hope that this actually clears the manifold. That's pretty tight. I think that'll be just fine. That should be able to reach just about any battery. Cool. Now I'm gonna have to ruin my paint to put this on. But no worries, I'm gonna have to go around and paint all these little spots later on anyway. Alright, so now we should be able to get some power to this thing. I made sure to loop this up in a nice big curve so it has a little bit of wiggle room here. Normally you don't want that positive cable to move a whole lot, but this being a Unimog, that transmission is going to be twisting a lot relative to the frame out here, so it needs a little bit of room to bend. But one thing I've actually noticed that this whole thing is missing is a good ground between the whole engine gearbox assembly and the chassis, because there is actually no grounding connection. It's just sitting on rubber bushings up here and down here by the cross member, so none of the metal is physically touching the frame. So it's actually pulling its ground through things like the axles that are touching by the springs up through the axles and to the gearbox, and also things like the PTO that are bolted to the chassis in one end and the gearbox in the other end. But you don't want to be pulling all of your grounding amps through all these components like that. I don't think we showed it in that video, but back when we were initially trying to get this going, we actually had a bit of trouble getting the starter to spin fast enough. And that's when I noticed it didn't really have good ground. So I ended up adding this little temporary ground wire here. I just bolted that onto the alternator that sits right here. That also has its own little ground. And that was actually enough that we got some more RPM out of that starter and we could get this thing going. Now normally you would have a flexible wire, kind of like this one, in between the chassis and the engine somewhere. Now I've been looking around a bit to try and figure out what the best place would be to put this, but it seems to be that it would actually be right here where I put this temporary one. So I'm just going to be removing this and putting this one on instead and bolting that onto the engine block in there somewhere. But I won't be doing that just now. I'll wait until I have all the other things assembled up here just to make sure this is not going to be getting in the way of anything. And actually the cab also needs one of those ground wires because it's not touching the chassis either. It's also sitting on rubber bushings all around. But this did actually have one of those grounds right here, but it is looking a little bit sad because someone bit it, so it's almost in two pieces. So I'm just going to be replacing that once we get the cab mounted again. Now before I move on, I want to get in there and just check up on my valve clearances because I'm sure that hasn't been done in decades. And it's going to be much easier to do it now before I mount a bunch of other stuff on here. Yikes. That's looking a bit more nasty since the last time I looked in there. So I suppose this is how you can tell your project cars are taking too long, when they start to rust on the inside. Now there's just been some condensation in the valve cover and that's just been dripping down onto it. So it is just some surface stuff, nothing's ruined. But yeah, it's about time we get this thing fired up again so we can get some oil splashing around in here. Alright, so because of how this looks, I'm just going to clean it up a little and oil it before I actually start to turn it. So now let's get to the actual valve part of this. So I'm not going to bore you with a whole lot of details because it really is exactly the same process as most other engines. You overlap on one cylinder and then you adjust the opposite one. And on this particular engine, it's 0.1 millimeters on the inlet and 0.4 millimeters on the exhausts. Actually, let's just check these before we do anything. Oh yeah, they are way too loose. Brilliant. Right there. Yeah. I'm not really a huge fan of the way you have to adjust these old Mercedes valves, because this is the nut you're adjusting, this here is the lock nut, and this down here is actually holding the valve stem itself, because these two are just threaded directly on the valve stem. So as you try to tighten this up, you have to hold the entire valve in place, or that's just going to be rotating and it's going to mess up your adjustment up here. So you need one wrench to actually hold the valve. Then you need another wrench to actually hold the nut you're adjusting, and another wrench to hold the lock nut down here. And also you have to hold your feeler gauge back here. So there's just a lot of things to hold at once, and it's a bit fiddly to do. That's good. Alright, so that's the valve clearance all set, and just in case some of you have been wondering about the dark spots on here, that's just some discoloring on the surface. It is actually nice and smooth everywhere, so it's not pitting or anything, so everything's all good. The last thing I want to check in here is just to make sure my chain is still all good. The tensioner is still nice and tight, and it's still nice and tight on there on both ends, so this is all looking pretty good. Now that's not a very scientific way to test that, but it's good enough for me. I do have a new gasket for this. That's probably not a bad thing. This is pretty stiff. Just gonna set this back on here for now, just to keep the dirt out, but I'm actually not gonna bolt it down just yet, because there is one more thing I'd like to do first, and that's fitting the injectors back in here. But I'm thinking we'll save that for the next video. So thanks for watching this one, and we'll see ya.